Lecture 2. How the Conversational Floor Works.
An expression like shooting the breeze, which dates back to World War II, can make casual conversation sound entirely free-flowing, like words are being tossed about in the flow of a gentle wind. But in fact, even the most breezy conversation, in that conversation there's an underlying systematic structure, and we follow some strikingly predictable routines. These routines can suddenly become apparent when we encounter a different routine in another language or culture. Here are a couple of my favorite examples. In Chinese, the way to say hello is ni hao, which means how are you? That may seem familiar enough, but the answer may not. The answer in Chinese to ni hao is ni hao. So when I was teaching English in China in the early 1990s, students would often respond to me when I would say, how are you? They would say, how are you? And I would say, no, in English, you actually say fine, which is equally meaningless as saying, how are you in response to how are you, but that's just what we do in English. Another way to greet someone in Chinese is to ask, 吃了吗? or 吃饭了没有? which means, have you eaten yet? Now, this question should not be seen as an invitation to lunch. In fact, it's just a warm greeting showing concern for your well-being. In this lecture, we'll work our way through a conversation from beginning to end as we navigate the conversational floor with others. Some of the information about the conversational floor may seem fairly obvious as soon as I say it. You'll think, oh my goodness, of course that's what we do. But some of what I will tell you will surprise you. Starting a conversation is probably the most ritualized part of the whole thing. In the US, possible greetings include hi, hey, hello, good morning, yo. Then there's sometimes a greeting question. How are you? What's up? Or the shortened version, sup. There are routinized answers to those questions. How are you? The answer is fine, okay, good. What's up? Nothing, not much. We have all experienced the disconcerting moment when someone takes a routine greeting question as a real question and suddenly is telling you how they really are. And you're thinking, no, I don't have time for this. I need to talk with you about something else. And often, if we really do want to know how someone is, we ask again. We'll say something like, so everything's really going okay? Kids are healthy again? It is possible to start a conversation without a ritual greeting, but it's unusual. It's also potentially unsettling for the person you're talking to, and in some parts of the world, it is considered highly impolite. Imagine, I walk up to you in the hall and say, I need to ask you about the memo I received from Marcus this morning. It makes the conversation feel abrupt and very directed, or very intimate, as if we just talked 5 minutes ago and I'm continuing that conversation. There's also perhaps an assertion of power here. I am assuming that you are available to talk to me whenever I want to talk to you. No greeting necessary. It's more likely that I'll start with, hi. Hi, do you have a minute? I need to ask you about the memo I received from Marcus this morning. That greeting acknowledges the other person and sets up a different, much more collegial tone. And I would advise all of you who work in an office where there are staff whose job it is to help you to think about this, that I think too often people walk up to staff members and say, I need you to do this for me, without a greeting, without an acknowledgement of that person, without setting this up as a conversation. Now, all of that assumed you were opening a conversation with people you knew, so you didn't have to introduce yourself in addition to saying hi. There's a more challenging situation. How do you open the floor and start a conversation with people you don't know? Here's a scenario that many of you have probably lived through. I certainly know I have. There you are, brought to a party or a wedding by a friend or spouse or someone else, and you're confronting a room of people you don't know. Your friend or spouse has disappeared, and there you are. You get a drink to kill some time, but now there's nothing to do other than try and find someone to talk to. Remember that many people find this difficult. It's not just you. It can help to see it as a challenge to yourself, to meet someone new and learn something new. So you walk up to these people who are in a conversation, and then what do? Let's look at Jessica try and do this.
Hello, everybody. My name's Jessica.
Hey.
Nice to meet you.
Hello.
Okay, that was a good start. But Jessica provided no context for the introduction, and she's thereby transferred the entire conversational burden to these other people, not only to introduce themselves, but also to come up with something else to say other than introductions. Let's try that again with a little bit more work from Jessica.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jessica. I came here with a friend and I don't really know anybody, so I thought I would just introduce myself.
Who'd you come with?
Kate? Oh, I know Kate.
I don't. Who's Kate?
Oh, she's right over there. How do you know Kate? Oh, she's my roommate.
In this version, Jessica has provided an opening for conversation, and she's given some context for her introducing herself. I have to say, it also doesn't hurt to have people feel sorry for you, as we all know how difficult Jessica's situation is. Now, once the floor is open, the negotiation of turns becomes less routinized, but it is far from entirely haphazard. We're being asked to take turns on the conversational floor, and I have to say that people do this with varying levels of grace. We've all seen speakers grab the floor from others, or perhaps we have been that speaker who has grabbed the floor from others, or speakers who hog the floor. As those verbs signal, grab and hog, our behavior can be more or less cooperative or competitive in handling the floor, and we'll talk about this. In negotiating the conversational floor, if we want this to be a dialogue and not a monologue, we need to give other people the chance to speak, and then take the floor ourselves to speak. To do this, we use conversational signals. I sometimes use the analogy of conversations and dancing. Taking turns can be like the footwork of dancing. I step back and you step forward. I step forward and you step back. And there are other signals too. When you're dancing, your partner might use a bit of pressure of their hand on your back to signal that it's your turn to do something. When we're talking, we're coordinating our moves in similar ways and sending signals to each other about whose turn it is to talk. So let's review some of the various turn-taking devices, things that you use and can watch for in everyday conversation. One of the obvious ways to tell people, to signal to people that it's their turn to talk is you stop talking. Silence. This is a very straightforward way to let someone else take the floor. Another straightforward way is the question and answer pair. Linguists call these adjacency pairs. So I ask a question, I'm clearly turning the floor over to you unless it's rhetorical, and then you get to answer. The same thing happens if I make an offer or an invitation. I'm giving the floor to you to accept or reject that invitation. Sometimes, as a way of giving over the floor, we'll trail off. It's not that we become completely silent, but we trail off with these little words like, so. And that's a way to say that we're done and somebody else can come in. Hand movements can be a signal. If we're someone who talks with our hands, as I do, sometimes we can signal that we're finishing by quieting down our hands or by gesturing toward the other person to give them the floor. Eye contact also sends signals. We often make direct eye contact as a way of giving someone the floor with our eyes. When we're talking with someone, often our eyes flit a little bit. We're not doing as much direct eye contact, but then we will look directly at the person to turn over the floor. Now, this is all very neat and orderly, and sometimes conversation is that way. But a lot of the time, we talk on top of each other. We don't wait for someone to hand us the floor before we start talking. This is where the dancing analogy breaks down a bit, because it isn't all neatly choreographed. We do the equivalent of stepping on each other's feet a lot. But it often doesn't feel like we're stepping on each other's feet. It feels very natural and not at all painful. Linguists call this simultaneous talk. And if you record a spontaneous conversation, you'll find a lot of it. This script does not look at all like talk on TV. I sometimes send students out with recorders, and they come back in disbelief of how many people can talk on top of each other at one time, 3 or 4 or more. Now, some of this simultaneous talk can be very cooperative. I step in at a moment when I think you're finished, or near the end of your turn, I'm providing some affirmation. Let's look at an example of a conversation between two men that has quite friendly simultaneous talk.
I'm just glad to be home. I was trapped at LaGuardia last night.
LaGuardia? My God, that place feels like the third world on a hot day.
Tell me about it. Then there were these two women that were literally yelling at each other.
No way, really?
Yeah, and the guy at the desk is over the intercom asking everyone to remain calm, and then I hear them ask if there's a doctor in the boarding
What
zone.
happened? Did someone have a heart attack?
Well, I have no idea. I didn't join the mob that gathered to rubberneck.
Here we see that David, while he is talking simultaneously, is providing positive feedback. And at another point, he's asking a question to further the story. This simultaneous talk doesn't feel like David is trying to grab the floor. But sometimes simultaneous talk clearly feels like an interruption. It feels like a grab for the floor. Let's look at a different version of the conversation between these two men.
I'm just glad to be home. I was trapped at LaGuardia Airport
So
last
did you
night.
get the memo I sent you last night?
I didn't. My laptop was out of juice at the airport. All the outlets were occupied. Then there were these ladies.
You know,
that were-
I once paid a kid $10 to unplug his iPod so I could recharge my laptop. That was LAX.
Well, $10 is pretty cheap.
Here, David jumps in when Charles is clearly not finished, but David seems to be finished, and David changes the topic. Charles then starts a story, but David steps in to tell his own. This simultaneous talk does not feel very cooperative. I do want to note here that some aspects of simultaneous talk are cultural. In my family, we see a lot of this simultaneous talk as highly cooperative overlap. We seem to think that if you know what somebody's going to say, then you might as well help them finish their sentence so that you can then continue on. But of course, not everyone sees that as fully cooperative behavior, and different parts of the country have different rhythms for conversation and different levels of tolerance for silence. So my advice is to watch yourself and make sure you're not cutting people off without meaning to. And if you catch yourself cutting someone off, apologize and try and give back the floor. You can say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I cut you off. Keep going." And if you are a simultaneous talker like me, step back sometimes if you can feel that you're doing this in a conversation and ask yourself, is there a rush for you to speak, or can you let this person finish? There's another kind of simultaneous talk that we barely notice, and that's those little listening noises that we make. These noises like, uh-huh, yeah, wow, huh. We also nod as part of this. Linguists call this kind of behavior back-channeling, and it's very, very helpful for other speakers. Back-channeling shows that we're listening, we're following along, we're engaged. And this is something that we almost all do on the phone. This is going to make you very self-conscious on the phone. When you hear yourself, you're going to hear yourself going, uh-huh, uh-huh. Because if you don't, fairly quickly somebody's going to stop and ask if you're still there. Now, I want to add a cautionary note here with back-channeling. If you are disagreeing with a speaker, someone's talking to you and you realize you don't agree, you may want to adjust your back-channeling. You want your back-channeling to signal that you're following, but not necessarily that you're agreeing. So you may want to use back channels more like, as opposed to, yeah, because that will throw a speaker if you're going, yeah, and then suddenly at the end, you disagree. There is a power play sometimes in not back channeling. And it's helpful to realize that you can use not back channeling to express skepticism or lack of engagement. So it's something you want to use cautiously because it really can throw people if they're talking with you and you're not sending any signals of engagement, but there are moments where that may be something you want to do. It's also worth remembering when you're an audience member. Back channeling can really make a difference for a speaker, especially in a smaller audience. If you're up there giving a talk, talking to an audience, it's really nice to have people nodding to give you a sense that people are engaged with what you're saying. Then I want to talk briefly about the issue of what I call talk time. I think all of us know people who don't seem to have a very good sense of talk time. That is, they seem to talk more than their fair share without ever really trying to turn the floor over. Are you suddenly worried that this might be you? Here are a few ways for you to try to figure it out. If you're talking and no one is back channeling, you should ask yourself what is happening. Have you overstayed your welcome on the conversational floor? If you find yourself near the end of a conversation saying, I've been talking this whole time, how are you? Then it's worth monitoring your talk time a bit. Or if you finish a conversation and realize that you know very little about what the other person thinks or what is going on with them, it is worth thinking about how much of the talking you did or how good your questions were. Remember that study showing the correlation between happiness and substantive conversation, and a substantive conversation ideally means hearing from both people. So we signal to people that we're engaged with back channeling. We also signal, as I mentioned earlier, when we're going to give a dispreferred response. In adjacency pairs like questions and answers, or an invitation and an acceptance or rejection, there's often a preferred response, something like yes, or accepting an invitation. So let's think of an example. You ask me, can you send that email to Jasmine? And I say, well, I'm preparing you for no. Or at least I'm preparing you for my attempt to get out of doing what you've asked me to do. Given this, it can throw people if this happens. You ask me, can you send that email? And I say, well, yeah, that's fine. If you do that, don't be surprised if someone then starts to say, is that going to be a problem? I mean, if it's a problem, you don't have to do it. They're doing that because you have sent signals with that and well, whether you know it or not, that for some reason this is a problem. These subtle signals also come up in conversation when we're assessing things. And this is coming from a study by Anita Pomerantz at the University of Albany. Let's imagine that I say, what a beautiful sunset. The preferred response for you is to agree. You say, yes, it is. Or you could even upgrade. I know it's gorgeous. If you choose to downgrade, it will feel almost like disagreement. So I say, look at that beautiful sunset. And you say, yeah, it's nice. If you do that, do not be surprised if your use of a weaker adjective elicits a question from me about whether you don't like it. Even though you've complimented it, you said it was nice. But by downgrading, you've sent me a signal that maybe you don't like it. In many of these examples, I've been talking about the little words we use that seem meaningless, but actually do a lot of conversational work. Linguists call them discourse markers, and you will now notice them at work all around you. These are words like well, so, now, you know. Discourse markers do some really important conversational work, but you need to be careful about overusing some of these, especially fillers and discourse markers like I mean, like, or you know. If you use discourse markers infrequently, they will typically go unnoticed, and they'll be able to go about their conversational work. If you use them often, people will start to focus on them, and they can become distracting. For discourse markers to work well, you need to monitor any overuse of one of them. So what do discourse markers do? They can do a couple of things. The first is that they can negotiate our position in relation to our listeners. The other thing they can do is help listeners know what kind of information is coming next. In this way, they're like street signs, almost saying, there's a left turn coming. So first, let's talk about the way that discourse markers can position me as a speaker in relation to you as a listener. A good example here is you know. If I use you know, it can be a way to create solidarity with you. I'm reaching out. So I might say something like, I went to a movie last night. You know, the one playing at the Cineplex. You know can also function organizationally to signal that trailing off the end of a turn. Another good example here is I mean. I mean can be a way for me to minimize my own authority. So I might say something like, I mean, I don't think that's right, which sounds very different from, I don't think that's right. That little I mean diminishes my authority a little bit in saying that. I mean can also be a way for me to adjust something I've said. That way it's like a street sign. I might say, I love that movie. I mean, it has its problems. So that I mean says I'm about to provide a caveat to what I just said. So with that, let's turn to the organizational moves that discourse markers can make. They show how what I'm about to say relates to what came before. We've talked about how well an can signal a dispreferred response already. The word so can show a logical consequence. So I'm saying something that is following up on what you're saying. So can also signal that a story is about to start. So this morning on my way to work. And can do very similar work. And is a way for me to latch what I'm saying onto what you said and suggest that my utterance is building on yours. It can feel very cooperative. The little word now is a focuser. It says there's important information coming, potentially a new topic. You will hear me using it in these lectures often as a way to signal a topic shift to say, pay attention here. Like can also be a focuser. You can get an example like, she works out every day and her arms are like completely ripped. If you're now thinking, that isn't all that like does, you're right. And I want to pause here for a couple of minutes to talk about like, because the social stakes are high with this word. The word like is a verb and a noun. It can also be a focuser, but it's used for other things too. It can be approximative. He's like 6 feet tall. It can also be quotative. So I was like, do you want to go to the movies? And she was like, sure, I'd be happy to, where it's substituting in for say or think. Then like can also serve as a filler. Fillers fill up the space or the conversational floor when we're not saying anything substantive. The words and well are fillers too. Now, why do we need fillers? One reason is to keep the floor. So you're in a turn, you know you're not done yet, and you say, to say, I'm not done. It can also be a way to signal to someone that you're going to answer. They ask you a question and you say, which is different from sitting there in silence as you think about the answer to the question. But young people also often use fillers a lot, especially like, and it may be a way for them to negotiate their position as not yet adults, because it can make them sound less confident, and sometimes conversationally they are less confident. That said, some well-known orators use strategically sometimes in a thoughtful pause. But like is not entirely like You may be judged for using filler like, and that is worth remembering in professional environments. There's a study by Jennifer Daly O'Kane at the University of Alberta, and what she found was that like is not necessarily used more by women. Many people think that it is. It also found that men and women who use like are judged as less intelligent, but highly likable. If you're now wondering whether you use discourse markers too much, try taping yourself in a professional context or in a personal context, but do ask permission from people before you tape them. You could also just ask someone who loves you. They will know if you have a discourse marker that you use a lot. Again, part of becoming an ever more effective speaker is becoming more aware of how you speak. Now, note the discourse marker. Now, as if you weren't self-conscious enough at this point, I'm going to tell you about what talking about the weather can do. I think we all get the sense that it can be a place to start a conversation. It's shared ground, maybe shared commiseration or happiness. It's a way to warm up a conversation. What you may not realize is that we use talking about the weather sometimes to wrap up a conversation. We've talked about stuff, we're nearing the end, and someone will say, "Can you believe this weather we're having?" as a way to say, time to wrap this up. And there's a great story here. I was reading an article about this, and I then went in to have a meeting with the chair of my department. And we have our meeting, and at the end of the meeting, he says, as we're wrapping up, he says, "I hear it's going to be almost 50 today." And I snort, which is a completely inappropriate response to the chair of your department talking about the weather, but it was so characteristic of what talking about the weather can do. In concluding this lecture, let's turn to closing a conversation, which is trickier than we sometimes realize. When you think about it, what we're trying to do is negotiate our way to silence. One way to think about it is how a famous article puts it. We are trying to address the closing problem, which is how can we get to the point where my saying something does not elicit a response from you. In other words, the turn-taking stops. And somehow you know and I know that this is not just a momentary silence. It turns out to be a fairly drawn-out process as we try and make sure that everyone has said what they're going to say, what they need to say, and is ready to close. So we give people multiple turns to make sure they're finished. Let's look at a closing to a spoken conversation.
Okay, so I'll call you about Saturday.
Sounds great.
Excellent. Good luck with your interview.
Thanks, I'll let you know.
Good.
Okay.
Take care.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
Look at all those turns where almost nothing was said. We got a lot of well, so, okay, bye. Interestingly, it appears that we take about as many turns to close when we're IMing or G-chatting to close things down. Let me share with you a written exchange. This comes from Naomi Barron's book, Always On, in which two women are closing down a conversation. Gail: "Hey, I gotta run." Sally: "Okay." Sally again: "I'll TTYL?" Gail: "Gotta do errands." Gail again: "Yep." Sally: "Okay." Sally: smiley face. Even when we're online, it can take multiple turns to make sure everybody's ready to end a conversation. So now I'll bring this lecture to a close, bring myself to silence, so that you can go watch and listen to people maneuvering the conversational floor. In the next lecture, we'll turn to a different set of strategies. Specifically, we'll look at how we use conversations to get things done. And we'll consider when we ask for things directly and when, instead, we prevaricate, use some flattery as a warm-up, or otherwise grease the conversational wheels, all to potentially good effect.